Hello everyone, my name is Sean and welcome to my channel where I talk about obscure languages and stuff. While I'm busy learning Farsi, it's time for us to talk about another language that couldn't be featured in last week's video. And today we're talking about Fiji Hindi, also known as Fiji Baat. Note, Fiji Hindi and Fijian are very different languages from very different language families, no relation. Let me explain. As the name suggests, it's Hindi, on Fiji. Kind of. In case you're unfamiliar with either term, Hindi is the most widespread language of India, where it is also the official language of government, and it's part of the Indo-European language family. And Fiji is a country in Oceania, made up of a few hundred islands in the Pacific Ocean, where the local inhabitants speak a language known as Fijian, which is a part of the Austronesian language family. Now, how on earth did this happen? How did speakers of Hindi end up thousands of kilometers away from their home in the middle of the Pacific Ocean? Well, the short answer is empire. The longer answer will require a bit of background. Also, it wasn't just speakers of Hindi. Let me take you back in time to the 19th century. Industry was booming, inventions were popping up left and right, and the British Empire was making sure that the sun never sets within its borders. Now, for the first half of the 19th century, the majority of native Fijians were still living traditional lifestyles, without any form of centralized government. There was a ton of messy tribal warfare, invasions from neighboring islands, and an increasing number of Europeans poking their noses where they probably shouldn't. But, uh-oh, what's this? It's the 1860s, and America is experiencing a not-so-civil civil war, and meanwhile, both the demand and price of cotton have never been higher. This results in a heavy influx of immigrants and settlers from America, but also Australia and other places, to Fiji, who are all looking to get in on the trade. And in turn, this results in an increased demand for labor, so many laborers were imported from neighboring Pacific islands such as Vanuatu, Kiribati, the Solomon Islands, and others. In order for the plantation workers to communicate with the native Fijians, to communicate with the new laborers from wherever, a new pidginized version of Fijian began emerging. Remember, a pidgin is a grammatically simplified language that develops between groups of people that don't have a language in common. But then, after a short-lived independent kingdom of Fiji and a series of other complicated events that we're not really going to be going into, Fiji became part of the British Empire on the 10th of October, 1874. Cotton, by the way, is just so 1860 late. Am I right, guys? Sugar cane's where the money is now. So the demand is still there, but where do we get the people to work the plantations? And so, on the 14th of May, 1879, 463 Indians arrived on the shores of Fiji, the first of over 60,000 to do so under the Indian Indenture System. The rules of the system were basically this. Indian workers, known under the term Girmitia, were brought over to Fiji on a 5-year contract, after which they were free to return back to India, but at their own expense. Alternatively, they could choose to renew their contract for an additional 5 years, after which they were either free to remain in Fiji indefinitely, or the government would pay for their return back to India. Well, the majority ended up staying the full 10 years and then some, because unfortunately returning back to India on your own dime was just not possible for many of the workers. Needless to say, the system was kinda sketchy, not just because of the contract, but also the conditions in the plantations and the pay were less than ideal. It sucked. This system wasn't exclusive to just Fiji, by the way. Thousands of Indian laborers were shipped all around the globe to different colonies, such as Jamaica, Suriname, South Africa, Malaysia, Trinidad and Tobago, and so many others. Back to Fiji, though. The people brought over from India were also from very different parts of India, and spoke different languages and dialects as well. The majority, at around 75 to 80%, were brought over from central and eastern India, bringing with them their dialects such as Bhojpuri, Maithili, and Awadhi. Then there were also some 15% brought over from western India, bringing with them such dialects as Dehlavi and Bundeli. The remaining percentage were brought over from regions of southern India who spoke a variety of Dravidian languages unrelated to Hindi at all, such as Tamil and Telugu. Over the next several decades, a distinct language was slowly developing from the mixing of all the different people and their need to communicate with one another. Now add to that some actual native Fijian, some English, and even a little bit of the languages the other Pacific Islanders spoke, and bam! You got yourself some Fiji Hindi. And then, once the children began speaking it all as a first language, the pidgin evolves into a real fully fledged language of its own. Percy Wright, who lived in Fiji during the indenture period, writes, Indian children born in Fiji will have a mixed language. There are many different dialects amongst the Indian population, and of course much intercourse with the Fijians. The children pick up a little of each language, and do not know which is the one originally spoken by their parents. The indenture system officially ended in 1916, but still, tens of thousands of Indians ended up staying in their newly found home. And now, on the 14th of May every year, the Fiji Hindi community commemorates the memory of their people and the birth of their identity, and it's known as Girmit Day. Over the course of the next several decades, the rapid development of Fiji, as well as the influx of free immigrants from India, caused the populations of all the communities to increase. Fiji officially gained independence on the 10th of October 1970, after 96 years of British rule. Over the course of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, though, due to the growing political unrest, thousands of Fiji Indians, or Indo-Fijians, had been leaving Fiji for places such as the US, UK, Australia, and other parts of the Commonwealth. The society and government in Fiji were also experiencing some racial problems, as the native Fijians were becoming increasingly unhappy with the rapidly growing community of Indo-Fijians and also their involvement in the local government. In 1987, a military coup d'etat happened. Fiji became a republic, and the ensuing political unrest only further accelerated the emigration of Indo-Fijians to other places, away from Fiji. I'm really oversimplifying this, by the way, so take it all with a grain of salt. There's just so much that goes into it. In any case, in 1997, a new constitution is drafted, proclaiming 3 official languages: English, Fijian, and Fiji Hindi, sometimes referred to as Hindustani in official texts, which I personally consider to be a bit misleading and confusing for a variety of reasons, but none of my business, I guess. There were actually 2 more military coups after that, in 2000 and in 2006, and then also a constitutional crisis in 2009. But it's all kind of fine now, right? Today, the population of Fiji is around 925,000, and out of those, around 340,000, or around 37%, are Indo-Fijians. There are over 400,000 speakers of Fiji Hindi, most of whom live in Fiji, but also in the many Indo-Fijian communities around the world. There are actually about 60,000 in Australia, 38,000 in New Zealand, 30,000 in the US, 24,000 in Canada, and a further few thousand sprinkled around elsewhere. Fiji Hindi is written using both the Latin and Devanagari scripts, but I'm guessing it's a more of a however you feel like basis, because some Bible translations that I found, as well as the Fiji Hindi Wikipedia, are written using the Latin script, while the Constitution of the Republic of Fiji in Fiji Hindi is written using the Devanagari script. So yeah. Speaking of the Constitution, despite both Fijian and Fiji Hindi being official languages, according to point 4 of section 3 of chapter 1 of the 2013 Constitution of the Republic of Fiji, if there is an apparent difference between the meaning of the English version of a provision of this Constitution and its meaning in the Itāukei and Hindi versions, the English version prevails. So gotta keep that in mind. All languages are official, but some are more official than others, it seems. There has also been a lot of pressure over the years from the side of the native Fijians to prioritize the promotion of the Fijian language rather than Fiji Hindi, and some even opposed the idea of Fiji Hindi being recognized at all. I guess you can kind of understand their point of view on this, because it was kind of forced on them by a former colonial power, and they had no say in anything, but at the same time, it's history now. Indo-Fijians are here to stay, and they're still people at the end of the day. They constitute such a large percentage of the population that the status of Fiji Hindi will remain. This is further demonstrated by point 3 of section 31 of the same chapter of the Constitution, which reads, "Conversational and contemporary Itāukei and Fiji Hindi languages shall be taught as compulsory subjects in all primary schools." The University of the South Pacific also offers classes. There are TV and radio broadcasts in Fiji Hindi, and in 2007 the first film in Fiji Hindi was produced, called Adhura Sapna, or Incomplete Dream. Now, that's all fine and dandy, but I also wanted to quickly mention some cool grammatical features that separate Fiji Hindi from the Hindi dialects that it's derived from. Linguist Dr. Paul G. wrote a letter to the editor of a newspaper, which reads, "Your correspondent writes Fiji Hindi has no structure in terms of grammar, tenses, and meaning. Not true. Fiji Hindi has its own grammar, which is different from the grammar of standard Hindi." First of all, while there are some exceptions, Fiji Hindi, for the most part, doesn't have plurals. So, for example, one house is ek ghar, and 2 houses is dui ghar, where ghar, the house, doesn't change. Another thing is that Fiji Hindi doesn't have the definite article the, and instead the equivalent is made using the suffix wa. So, for example, larka is a boy, and larkwa is now the boy. Additionally, another cool thing that happened is the reverse order of the number system. So while in standard Hindi, 37 is saintis, which is the short version of sat aur tis, literally 7 and 30, in Fiji Hindi, this becomes tis aur sat, literally 30 and 7. And same for the rest of the numbers. So 41 in standard Hindi is iktalis, the shortened version of ek aur chalis, becomes chalis aur ek in Fiji Hindi. It's actually so crazy to think about the fact that thousands of Indians came over to this one island nation thousands of kilometers away from home, and over the course of around 100 years, the entire landscape, demographics, culture, and society are so different to what they were. As much as some people may be opposed to this, it seems as though Indo-Fijians are here to stay on Fiji, and they are proud of their identity and culture. As linguist Dr. Paul G. writes in that same letter to the editor, I have taught hundreds of USP students over the years in linguistics class to learn to appreciate their own language, and I am pleased to report that all Fiji Hindi-speaking students have enjoyed and profited from studying their native tongue, and all have written term papers on aspects of Fiji Hindi phonology, grammar, and lexicon. My impression is that there is boundless enthusiasm for Fiji Hindi among the younger generation, not just as a means of colloquial communication, but as a vibrant language that only needs to be developed to serve as a language of education, government, etc. Fiji is truly a melting pot of cultures, and to all the Fijians out there, whether native, of Indian descent, or of any other descent, I wish you all nothing but the very best. Till next week, have a good one, peace out.